Can she even afford the flowers? I heard my daughter-in-law whisper those words just 5 feet away from me as I stood beside my husband's casket, and what hurt the most wasn't the cruelty in her voice. It was the fact that nobody corrected her. The funeral home smelled like lilies and polished wood, the kind of place designed to make grief look elegant for a few expensive hours. Outside, cold November rain slid down the tall windows in slow gray streaks, while guests in black coats moved quietly through the hallway, holding paper cups of coffee and speaking in those fake soft voices people only use around death. My husband Harold had always hated that kind of performance. "When I go," he used to say, "don't let people turn me into a social event." But that morning, that was exactly what his funeral had become. A performance. And I was the least important person in the room. I stood beside Harold's casket in a simple black dress I'd owned for nearly 12 years. No diamonds. No expensive handbag. No dramatic makeup. At 68 years old, I had stopped trying to impress people a long time ago. But apparently, my appearance had convinced my husband's family that I was one hospital bill away from poverty. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, gave me one of those tight little smiles women use when they want credit for pretending to care. "Evelyn," she said gently, touching my arm like I was fragile glass, "if the funeral expenses become overwhelming, Daniel and I may be able to help a little." I looked at her for a moment without answering. Behind her, my son Daniel Jr. avoided eye contact while pretending to read the memorial card. That alone told me everything. They'd already been talking about money before Harold was even buried. "That's very thoughtful," I said quietly. Vanessa nodded with visible satisfaction, like she'd just performed an act of charity in front of witnesses. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "I know Harold handled most of the finances. These things can get confusing." Confusing. I almost smiled. For 37 years, I had managed every investment, every tax return, every payroll account, every contract renewal, every late night. Financial crisis inside Harold's company, while the world praised my husband as a self-made businessman. Harold used to joke that I was the invisible engine behind everything. But over time, invisibility stopped feeling like a compliment. Across the room, Harold's sister Margaret stood near the guest book wearing a navy designer suit and an expression that suggested she was attending a board meeting instead of a funeral. She spotted me looking at her and immediately glanced away, whispering something to one of her friends. A few seconds later, both women looked directly at my shoes. I looked down too. Black flats. Comfortable. Sensible. Apparently not expensive enough for mourning etiquette in their world. A young funeral attendant approached me carefully. "Mrs. Harper," he said softly, "the florist needs confirmation for the graveside arrangement." Before I could answer, Vanessa stepped forward. "Keep it modest," she said quickly. "We don't want unnecessary expenses." The attendant looked confused. I watched him glance between us, trying to figure out who actually had authority. Then I remembered the last conversation Harold and I had 3 days before he died. He could barely speak above a whisper by then, but his eyes were still sharp. "Promise me something," he had said from his hospital bed. "Don't tell them anything until after the funeral." I remember asking him why. Harold gave the smallest tired smile. "Because I want to know who they are when they think you have nothing." At the time, I thought grief medication was making him cynical. Standing there in the funeral home, while my own family discussed me like I was a financial burden standing in the corner, I realized he had known exactly what would happen. Guests continued arriving. Old business associates shook my hand politely before drifting toward Daniel. Women I barely recognized hugged me for exactly 3 seconds before asking whether I planned to stay in the house alone now. One man actually asked if I would move into assisted living. Assisted living. In the middle of my husband's funeral. I answered every question with the same calm smile, while something cold and clear slowly settled inside me. Not anger. Not even heartbreak anymore. Just clarity. I could see all of them now. Vanessa circulating through the room like she was already the new matriarch of the Harper family. Daniel checking his phone every few minutes while avoiding me completely. Margaret watching the guests carefully, probably estimating Harold's estate in her head down to the last dollar. None of them looked grief-stricken. They looked curious, hungry. And the saddest part was that Harold had spent decades protecting these people, defending them, helping them financially whenever they failed at something. Yet less than 2 hours after his funeral began, they were already measuring the value of what he left behind. A church bell rang softly outside as more rain tapped against the windows. I turned toward Harold's casket and rested my fingers gently against the polished wood. "You were right," I whispered under my breath. Then I straightened my shoulders just as Vanessa's voice carried across the room again. "After today," she said confidently to someone nearby, "we'll need to discuss what's best for Evelyn moving forward." I didn't respond. I simply looked at my husband's photograph sitting beside the flowers and remembered the final thing he told me before he closed his eyes for the last time. "Let them underestimate you," he whispered. "Just once, let them show you exactly who they are." The burial was scheduled for 1 o'clock, but by noon the funeral home had already started emptying out in waves of polite handshakes and careful sympathy. I stood near the hallway entrance thanking people for coming, while Vanessa somehow positioned herself beside me every single time someone important approached. "Harold talked about you all the time," one older businessman told me warmly before turning to Daniel. "Your father was proud of you." Daniel smiled quickly, accepting praise he had not earned with the ease of someone who had spent his whole life standing in borrowed light. I watched him straighten his tie and nod thoughtfully, as if he had spent years helping run the company instead of drifting from one expensive hobby to another. "Harold used to say Daniel had potential." I used to say? Potential was not the same thing as character. The tension between those two truths had followed our marriage for decades. Vanessa stepped closer to the businessman and lowered her voice just enough for me to hear. "This has all been very hard on Evelyn," she said. "She has never really handled financial matters before." The businessman gave me a sympathetic look that landed somewhere between pity and concern. I smiled politely again. By that point, I was beginning to understand that my silence was making everyone unusually comfortable. They filled the empty space with assumptions. Weak widow, confused older woman, fragile burden. It fascinated me how quickly people rewrote your identity the moment they thought you had no power left. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the cemetery covered in wet gray fog. Black umbrellas moved slowly across the hills while the funeral procession gathered near the hearse. Margaret adjusted her gloves dramatically before stepping beside me. "You should let Daniel handle most things after today," she said quietly. "These situations can overwhelm women our age." Our age. Margaret was 63 and had spent the last 15 years pretending she was 50. "I appreciate your concern," I answered calmly. She tilted her head slightly, disappointed that I had not reacted emotionally. I noticed that about her. Margaret enjoyed provoking weakness in people. It made her feel superior. During the drive to the cemetery, Vanessa rode with Daniel while I sat alone in the back of Harold's town car. The leather still carried the faint scent of his cologne, cedarwood and pepper, and for the first time all morning the grief finally broke through the numbness. 37 years. That was how long Harold and I had built a life together. We met when I was 29 years old working as a junior accountant for a manufacturing firm in Cleveland. Harold was ambitious, loud, charming, and completely reckless with money back then. He had ideas bigger than his budget and confidence bigger than his experience. Everyone remembers the successful version of a man. Nobody remembers the nights before success when creditors called during dinner and bills sat unopened on the kitchen counter because fear made them too painful to read. But I remembered. I remembered balancing invoices at 2 in the morning while Harold slept on the couch after 18-hour workdays. I remembered selling my mother's jewelry to make payroll during the company's second year. I remembered sitting across from hostile bankers while 8 months pregnant, convincing them not to pull financing because I understood the numbers better than Harold ever did. But over time, people stopped asking what I did for the company. Eventually, they assumed I did nothing at all. At the cemetery, cold wind moved through the trees as the pastor began reading scripture beside the grave. Vanessa dabbed at perfectly dry eyes with a tissue while Daniel stared down at his shoes. Margaret scanned the crowd like she was counting attendees at a charity luncheon. And standing there beside Harold's coffin, I realized something painful. I was the only person truly saying goodbye to him. Everyone else had already moved on to whatever came next. After the service ended, guests slowly returned to their cars while family remained behind beneath the cloudy afternoon sky. That was when Vanessa finally said what she had clearly been waiting all day to say. "We should probably discuss the house soon," she said carefully, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. "A place that large may not be practical anymore." Daniel nodded immediately. "It is a lot for one person, Mom." "Mom." He only called me that when he wanted something. I have managed the house for 22 years, I said evenly. I think I can continue managing it for one more week. Vanessa laughed softly like I had made a harmless little joke. Of course, nobody is rushing you. But her eyes told a different story. They had already begun planning my future without me in it. Margaret stepped closer. There are some lovely retirement communities outside Scottsdale, she said. A few of my friends moved there after their husbands passed. Smaller homes, less stress, easier financially. Financially, there it was again. That word followed me around all day like perfume I could not wash off. I looked at the three of them standing together near Harold's grave while cold wind lifted the edges of their dark coats. They looked united now, comfortable, certain, and suddenly I understood why Harold had asked me to stay silent. He wanted me to see what happened when people believed the gatekeeper was gone. They circled immediately, not around grief, around opportunity. Daniel checked his watch before speaking again. The lawyer is meeting with us tomorrow morning, right? He asked casually. Casual questions are often the most revealing ones. Yes, I answered. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Margaret, so brief most people would have missed it. But I did not miss anything anymore. Good, Vanessa said softly. Then we can finally get some clarity. I turned toward Harold's grave one last time before walking back toward the waiting cars. The wet grass softened beneath my shoes and cold air burned gently in my lungs. Behind me, I could hear my family discussing schedules, paperwork, and property while the fresh earth above my husband's coffin had not even settled yet. And somewhere deep beneath my grief, something sharper began quietly waking up. By the time I arrived home that evening, the sky had turned the deep blue-gray color that only appears after long days of rain. Harold's car rolled slowly through the iron gates and stopped in front of the house we had spent 22 years building together, room by room, decision by decision, memory by memory. The porch lights glowed softly against the wet stone walkway, and for one strange second I forgot he was gone. I caught myself expecting the front door to open, expecting Harold to step outside with that impatient look he always wore whenever I took too long getting out of the car. But the house stayed still, quiet, empty in a way that felt unnatural. The driver offered his condolences one final time before leaving me alone beneath the cold evening air. I stood there for a moment holding my coat closed against the wind while staring at the windows upstairs. From the outside, the house looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. That was the cruel thing about loss. The world rarely changed shape to match your grief. Inside, the silence wrapped around me immediately. No television playing financial news in Harold's study. No sound of him moving papers around at the dining room table. No half-finished cup of coffee forgotten beside the sink. Just silence, so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking from across the foyer. I placed my purse carefully on the entry table and noticed a small envelope resting beneath the lamp. My name was written across the front in Harold's handwriting. Evelyn. My chest tightened instantly. For a moment, I could not move. Then slowly, I picked it up and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. If you are reading this at home, it means the performance at the funeral probably went exactly the way I expected. I almost laughed despite myself. Even now, Harold knew these people too well. I carried the letter into the kitchen and sat alone at the long wooden table where we had shared thousands of ordinary evenings together. The rest of the letter was short. Trust yourself. Do not let guilt make decisions for you. And most importantly, remember whose hands built everything they are about to fight over. I read those lines 3 times before setting the paper down carefully beside me. Then I looked around the kitchen and memories began arriving one after another without warning. Harold pacing near the refrigerator during the recession in 2008 when the company nearly collapsed. Me sitting at this same table surrounded by spreadsheets and loan agreements while trying to figure out how to keep 200 employees from losing their jobs. Daniel complaining upstairs because we had canceled his spring break trip that year, while Harold and I quietly borrowed against our retirement accounts to save the business. Nobody ever knew that part of the story, not even Daniel. Publicly, Harold was the brilliant founder who survived impossible odds. Privately, I was the one negotiating debt restructuring with banks at midnight while teaching myself corporate tax law from library books because we could not afford another attorney. People always assumed I stayed home because I lacked ambition. The truth was simpler and less flattering to them. Harold trusted me with the parts that actually mattered. A soft vibration interrupted my thoughts. My phone lit up against the table. Vanessa. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello. Evelyn. Vanessa said sweetly, her tone instantly too warm to be genuine. I just wanted to check on you. Today must have been overwhelming. I looked out the kitchen window toward the dark backyard where Harold used to sit every morning with his coffee. It was a long day, I answered. Well, Daniel and I were talking, and we thought maybe tomorrow after the lawyer meeting, we could help organize some of Harold's paperwork for you. Insurance documents, account information, things like that. There it was again. Not grief. Administration. Acquisition. That will not be necessary, I said calmly. A brief silence followed. Oh, Vanessa replied carefully. We just assumed you might need support. I almost asked her support with what exactly? Numbers? Contracts? Investment portfolios? The woman had once asked me whether municipal bonds were connected to city construction permits. But instead I simply said, I appreciate the concern. Another silence. I could practically hear her adjusting strategy in real time. Well, she said lightly, tomorrow may answer a lot of questions for everyone. Everyone. Not family. Not us. Everyone. After we hung up, I remained at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Rain began again outside, tapping gently against the windows while shadows settled deeper through the house. Eventually I stood and walked upstairs toward Harold's study. The room still smelled faintly like leather and cedar. His reading glasses rested exactly where he left them beside an open legal pad filled with notes from weeks ago. I ran my fingers lightly across the desk before kneeling beside the built-in cabinet near the bookshelf. Hidden behind a row of old financial binders was a small steel lockbox. Harold and I had used it for years. Inside were documents nobody else knew existed. Partnership agreements, trust amendments, stock certificates, quiet proof of who truly owned what. I opened the box slowly and removed. The top folder, Harper Industrial Holdings. Majority ownership, Evelyn Harper. I stared at the papers while the sound of rain filled the silent room around me. Downstairs, my phone buzzed again with another message from Vanessa asking what time we should all meet at the attorney's office tomorrow morning. I closed the folder carefully and locked the box again before standing beside the window overlooking the dark lawn. Somewhere across town, my family was probably discussing inheritances over expensive wine and polite concern. They still believed tomorrow would be about dividing Harold's empire between themselves. None of them understood one simple truth yet. Harold's empire had never actually belonged to Harold alone. The next morning arrived cold and painfully bright, the kind of clear autumn day that feels almost insulting after a funeral. I woke before sunrise out of habit and walked slowly downstairs in silence, wrapping Harold's old gray cardigan around myself before starting coffee in the kitchen. For years, mornings had belonged to us alone. Harold reading market reports at the counter while pretending not to steal pieces of toast from my plate. Me reviewing company numbers before the rest of the world started making demands. Even after all these years, we moved around each other naturally, like two people who had spent decades learning the same rhythm. Now the kitchen felt too large for one person. I stood at the sink watching pale sunlight stretch across the backyard while the coffee brewed behind me. Then I noticed tire tracks near the front driveway. Fresh ones. My stomach tightened slightly. I walked toward the front window and froze. A black luxury SUV sat parked near the curb. Vanessa stepped out first wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored wool coat that probably cost more than my first car. Daniel followed behind her while speaking on his phone. And standing beside them was a man in a navy blazer, holding a leather folder beneath his arm. A realtor. I stared through the window in complete silence as Vanessa pointed toward the house with casual confidence, gesturing like someone giving a property tour. The realtor nodded politely while studying the exterior columns and landscaping. They were evaluating my home less than 24 hours after Harold's burial. Something inside me should have broken at that moment. Instead, I felt strangely calm, almost detached, like I had finally stopped expecting decency from people who had none to offer. I opened the front door before they reached the porch. Vanessa jumped slightly, clearly not expecting me to appear so quickly. Evelyn, she said brightly, you are up early. Apparently not as early as all of you, I replied. Daniel ended his phone call awkwardly and slipped the device into his pocket. Mom, this is Richard Palmer. He specializes in luxury properties. Richard gave me a professional smile. Very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Harper. Thank you, I answered evenly before looking back at Daniel. And why exactly is a realtor standing outside my house? Daniel shifted uncomfortably while Vanessa stepped smoothly into the silence. Nobody is trying to pressure you, she said quickly. We just thought it might help to understand market value before making long-term decisions. Long-term decisions. They spoke about my future like I was no longer fully capable of participating in it. Interesting, I said softly. And when were you planning to ask permission to evaluate my property? Vanessa gave a small laugh meant to sound harmless. Evelyn, nobody meant anything disrespectful. Richard suddenly looked desperate to be somewhere else. Perhaps this is not the ideal timing, he offered carefully. No, I said while keeping my eyes on Vanessa. I believe the timing says quite a lot. For a brief second, the polite mask slipped from Vanessa's face. Irritation flashed through her expression before disappearing just as quickly. We are only trying to help, she said. Managing an estate this size can become overwhelming. There was that word again. Overwhelming. As if age itself made me incapable. I folded my arms calmly against the cold morning air. I have managed this household and Harold's business affairs longer than you have been part of this family. Daniel blinked in surprise. Vanessa looked genuinely confused. It almost amused me how little they actually knew about my life. To them, I was simply Harold's quiet wife who hosted dinners and mailed Christmas cards. They had never bothered looking deeper because they never imagined there might be something worth seeing. Richard cleared his throat politely. I should probably leave you folks to your morning. I think that would be best, I answered. He nodded quickly before returning to his SUV. Vanessa watched him drive away with visible frustration before turning back toward me. You did not have to embarrass us. I almost laughed at the word embarrass, as though my refusal to surrender gracefully had somehow inconvenienced them. I believe you embarrassed yourselves, I said calmly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, nobody is trying to take advantage of you. I looked directly at my son then, really looked at him. 45 years old. Expensive coat. Expensive watch. Expensive habits. And underneath all of it, the same frightened little boy who spent his entire life assuming someone else would always clean up the consequences of his decisions. Then perhaps you should stop behaving like people who are, I answered quietly. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Vanessa checked her watch. We should leave soon anyway. The attorney meeting is at 10. I nodded once. I will meet you there. They returned to their vehicle without another word. As the SUV disappeared down the street, I closed the front door slowly and leaned against it for a moment. The house fell silent again except for the faint ticking of the hallway clock. Then my eyes drifted toward the staircase leading upstairs to Harold's study. Last night, I had opened the lockbox for the first time in years. But there was still one thing inside I had not read completely. I walked upstairs carefully, entered the study, and unlocked the steel box once more. Beneath the ownership documents and trust papers rested a sealed envelope marked in Harold's handwriting. For Evelyn only after the funeral. I sat down slowly in Harold's leather chair before opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter several pages long. The first sentence alone made my pulse stop cold. If Daniel and Vanessa have already started circling the house, then everything happened sooner than I expected. My hands stayed perfectly still as I unfolded Harold's letter, but inside, something deep in my chest had already begun shifting into place. The study was quiet except for the soft hum of the heating vents and the distant sound of wind brushing against the windows. Harold's handwriting covered 3 full pages, sharp and precise even near the end of his illness. Evelyn, if Daniel and Vanessa have already started circling the house, then everything happened sooner than I expected. Do not hate them for it. Weak people reveal themselves fastest when they smell money or fear. I closed my eyes briefly after reading that line. Harold had spent years making excuses for Daniel. Even now, after death, he was still trying to soften the disappointment. I continued reading slowly. I know you will want to protect Daniel because you are his mother, but you cannot save a grown man from becoming the person he chooses to be. I leaned back in Harold's chair and stared at the shelves lining the office walls. Awards, framed magazine covers, photographs of Harold shaking hands with governors and business leaders. Publicly, he had always looked larger than life. But sitting there alone with his final letter in my hands, I remembered the private version of my husband. The exhausted man who sometimes woke at 3 in the morning terrified the company would collapse. The man who once admitted during a recession that he trusted me more than he trusted himself. The man who understood people deeply enough to predict exactly what his own family would do before the dirt settled on his grave. My eyes moved farther down the page. The attorney meeting today will tell you everything you need to know. Watch carefully. The people who rush toward your grief are not always coming to comfort you. Sometimes they are measuring the furniture. A bitter smile touched my mouth despite everything. That sounded exactly like Harold. Blunt, observant, painfully accurate. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope before checking the time. 9:15. I still had 45 minutes. Before the attorney meeting downtown. For a moment, I considered staying home entirely. But avoidance had never solved anything in my life. I stood, straightened my coat, and looked once more around the office. Then I locked the steel box and slipped the key into my purse. By the time I arrived at the law office, Daniel and Vanessa were already waiting in the lobby beside Margaret. All three looked unusually alert, dressed less like grieving relatives and more like people attending a corporate merger. Vanessa stood immediately when she saw me. "Evelyn," she said warmly. "We were beginning to worry." "No, you were beginning to wonder if I would appear at all," I thought silently. "Traffic was heavier than usual," I replied. Margaret kissed the air near my cheek without actually touching me. "You look tired," she observed. This process can become emotionally draining. I noticed she carried a legal notebook in her handbag. Interesting. Daniel approached next, adjusting the cuff of his expensive navy suit. "Morning, Mom." He hesitated before adding, "Did you bring all the paperwork?" There it was again. Not "how are you feeling?" Not "did you sleep?" Paperwork. "I brought what is necessary," I answered calmly. Before he could ask anything else, the receptionist escorted us into a large conference room overlooking downtown Cleveland. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, while polished walnut furniture reflected the pale morning light. A tray of coffee and pastries sat untouched near the far wall. Nobody looked interested in food today. Attorney Richard Bennett entered a moment later carrying several thick folders beneath his arm. I had known Richard nearly 20 years. Unlike most people in Harold's professional circle, he had always understood exactly how much involvement I had in the company. His eyes met mine briefly as he sat down at the head of the table. "Mrs. Harper," he said respectfully with a small nod. Then he acknowledged the others more formally before opening the first folder. "First," Richard began, "allow me to express my condolences regarding Harold's passing. He was a remarkable man." Vanessa immediately lowered her eyes and practiced sadness. Daniel folded his hands together solemnly. Margaret sighed softly beside me. If strangers walked into that room, they would have believed we were a close family united by grief. Richard continued speaking about estate procedures, trust administration, and probate timelines while I quietly observed everyone around the table. Daniel leaned forward each time financial terms appeared. Vanessa kept glancing toward the folders like she expected hidden treasure maps inside them. Margaret took notes constantly. Not one of them asked a single question about Harold's charitable foundation, memorial arrangements, or final wishes beyond assets. Eventually, Richard paused and folded his hands together carefully. "Before we proceed further," he said, "there are several important clarifications regarding ownership structures that Harold wanted addressed personally." The room grew noticeably still. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other while Daniel straightened in his chair. Margaret capped her pen slowly. Richard opened another folder. "Many assumptions have been made over the years regarding Harper Industrial Holdings," he continued evenly. "However, the ownership structure is not what most people believe." I remained silent. Across the table, Daniel frowned slightly. "What does that mean exactly?" Richard glanced toward me once before answering. "It means Harold was not the majority owner of the company." For the first time all morning, nobody moved. Even the room itself seemed to freeze around us. Vanessa blinked twice. "I do not understand," she said carefully. Richard turned one page inside the folder. Harold Harper held 29% ownership in the company at the time of his death. Daniel stared at him in confusion. 29%. Richard nodded once. "The remaining controlling interest belongs to Mrs. Evelyn Harper." Silence crashed into the room so completely I could hear the faint ticking of the conference room clock on the wall behind me. And for the first time since Harold died, every single person at that table finally looked directly at me. The silence inside the conference room stretched so long it almost became physical. Daniel stared at Richard as though he had spoken another language entirely. Vanessa's carefully polished composure cracked first. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh that sounded painfully thin in the stillness. Richard remained calm. "There is no mistake." Margaret leaned forward slowly, her expression tightening. "Harold founded the company himself," she said. "Everyone knows that." "Yes," Richard replied evenly. "And over the years, ownership percentages evolved through various restructuring agreements, investment protections, and estate planning strategies." Vanessa turned toward me then, eyes narrowed with confusion. "You own most of the company?" she asked carefully. I folded my hands quietly in my lap before answering. "For many years now." Daniel blinked repeatedly, like he was trying to force reality back into a shape he recognized. Why would Dad never tell anyone that? The question hung in the room for several seconds. Finally, I answered softly. "Because your father understood people better than you think." Richard opened another folder while the shock continued settling across their faces. "Mrs. Harper also serves as sole controlling trustee over the Harper Family Trust," he continued, "which means all major financial and operational decisions now fall exclusively under her authority." Vanessa sat back slowly in her chair. The color had drained from her face. I watched the exact moment her entire understanding of the past 48 hours collapsed inward. Suddenly, the funeral comments, the realtor visit, the pitying smiles, all of it looked very different through this new reality. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom," he said carefully, "I did not realize you were so involved in the business side of things." So involved. I almost admired how quickly people revised history when power shifted. "There were many things you did not realize," I answered calmly. Margaret recovered first, as people like her usually do. Pride often survives shock faster than humility. "Well," she said stiffly, "none of this changes the fact that families should work together during difficult times." There it was. The pivot. Less than 24 hours earlier, they had discussed retirement homes and property sales as though I were incapable of independent thought. Now suddenly, I was family leadership material again. Richard continued speaking while distributing documents across the table. Harold left detailed instructions regarding the company, private holdings, investment accounts, and charitable foundations. Daniel reached immediately for the paperwork, while Vanessa leaned over his shoulder, trying to read ahead. I noticed neither of them asked how I felt about any of it. Their focus remained exactly where it had always been. Access, numbers, control. The total estimated value of Mrs. Harper's controlling assets, Richard continued professionally, currently exceeds $28 million, excluding certain long-term trusts and private equity holdings. Vanessa inhaled sharply. Daniel slowly lowered the papers back onto the table. Even Margaret stopped pretending to take notes. $28 million. Strange how money changes the temperature in a room. Just yesterday they had looked at me with polite pity. Today they looked almost cautious. I remained perfectly still while all three of them silently recalculated who I was. Richard continued outlining legal structures, board authority, and succession protocols, but I could feel the shift happening around me more clearly than his words. Vanessa no longer interrupted. Daniel no longer avoided eye contact. Margaret no longer sounded superior. Respect had not entered the room exactly, but fear had. And fear often wears the same clothes as respect when money is involved. Eventually, Richard closed the final folder. "That concludes the immediate overview," he said. "Additional meetings regarding operational transitions can be scheduled later this month." Nobody moved right away. Then Daniel finally looked toward me fully for the first time since Harold died. "Mom," he said slowly, "why did you never tell me any of this?" I studied my son quietly before answering. "You never asked." His expression tightened slightly. "I just assumed Dad handled everything." "Most people did," I replied. Vanessa attempted a small smile. "Honestly, Evelyn, this is incredible. Harold must have trusted you tremendously." "Trusted me." Interesting choice of words from the same woman who offered funeral flower charity 2 days earlier. "We trusted each other," I answered simply. Another silence settled over the room. Then Margaret spoke carefully. "Well, now that everything is clearer, I think we should all sit down together as a family and discuss what Harold would have wanted moving forward." I almost smiled again. Yesterday, they planned my future without my permission. Today, they wanted meetings and collaboration. Amazing what $28 million can do for family unity. Richard gathered several folders and handed them directly to me instead of Daniel. I noticed that detail did not escape anyone at the table. Mrs. Harper, he said respectfully, there are also several documents Harold requested you review privately before any additional decisions are made. Thank you, Richard. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. What kind of documents? Richard answered without hesitation. Confidential instructions regarding ownership protections and future voting authority. Ownership protections. That phrase landed heavily in the room. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. Protections from what exactly? Richard's expression remained neutral. Harold believed preparation was wise in all circumstances. Nobody spoke after that. Outside the conference room windows, Cleveland traffic moved steadily beneath the pale afternoon sky, while sunlight reflected against the glass towers downtown. Life continued normally for everyone else in the city. But inside that room, something irreversible had shifted forever. I gathered my papers calmly and stood from the table. The others immediately followed a second later, almost instinctively. For years, people had treated me like background decoration beside Harold's success. Quiet wife, aging widow, polite afterthought. And now suddenly every eye in the room followed me differently. Not because I had changed, because they had finally discovered what had always been there. As we walked toward the conference room door, Vanessa stepped beside me carefully. Evelyn, she said softly, I hope you know Daniel, and I only wanted what was best for you. I turned toward her slowly. No, I said in the gentlest voice I could manage. You wanted what was easiest for yourselves. The drive back from the attorney's office felt longer than the drive there, even though the streets of downtown Cleveland looked exactly the same under the fading afternoon light. Cars moved through intersections, pedestrians hurried along sidewalks, and life continued with complete indifference to what had just been revealed inside that conference room. I sat in the back seat of the car alone while Daniel drove and Vanessa stared out the passenger window without speaking. For the first time since the funeral, no one tried to speak to me as if I were fragile or confused. The silence this time was different. It was not dismissal. It was calculation. When we arrived at the house, Daniel parked in the driveway, but did not immediately turn off the engine. Vanessa turned halfway toward him. We need to talk, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. Yes. Inside, I stepped out of the car without waiting for either of them and walked toward the front door. I could feel their hesitation behind me, like they were unsure whether they still had permission to enter my home in the same way they had the day before. That thought alone almost made me smile. Inside, the house was exactly as I had left it that morning. The air was still, the rooms quiet, the light shifting gently across the wooden floors. I placed my coat on the entry table and moved toward the kitchen without looking back. I did not need to see their faces to know they were following me. Daniel spoke first once we were seated at the kitchen table. Mom, he said carefully, we need to understand what all of this means moving forward. I poured myself a glass of water before answering. It means nothing has changed about this house. Vanessa immediately leaned forward. But the company, the trust, the accounts, everything is now under your control. I looked at her calmly. It always was, legally speaking. You simply did not know that. That sentence seemed to unsettle her more than anything said in the attorney's office. Daniel ran his hand over his face. Why would Dad structure things this way without telling us? I set the glass down gently on the table. Your father did not trust uncertainty, I said, and he understood exactly how quickly people change when they believe power has shifted. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly. That is not fair. We are your family. The word family had been used so many times in the last 48 hours that it had begun to lose meaning. I studied her for a moment before replying. Family is not something you declare when it becomes convenient, I said quietly. It is something you demonstrate consistently. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We were just trying to make sure everything was handled properly for you. I nodded slightly. By deciding I needed to be moved out of my own home? Neither of them answered immediately. Outside the kitchen window, the late afternoon light had begun to fade into a soft gray. The same house where Harold and I had raised Daniel suddenly felt like a different place now that the balance of power inside it had changed. Vanessa spoke again, her voice softer this time. We were worried about you being alone in a house this size. There it was again. Concern packaged as control. I have lived alone in this house before, I replied. The difference now is that I am no longer being asked to justify it. Daniel exhaled slowly. Mom, we did not mean to upset you. I looked at my son then, really looked at him, the same way I had in the conference room earlier that day. I am not upset, I said. I am informed. That seemed to confuse him more than anger ever could. Vanessa glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. So what happens next? She asked carefully. I considered the question for a moment before answering. Next, things continue according to Harold's instructions. Daniel frowned. And what exactly does that include? I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the counter, taking my time before responding. It includes stability. It includes structure. And it includes decisions being made with full understanding of what is actually owned and controlled. I turned back toward them. It does not include assumptions. A long silence followed. For the first time since the funeral, neither of them attempted to speak over me. The change was subtle but undeniable. They were listening differently now, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty. The same uncertainty they had never considered when they were planning to sell my home and organize my future. Daniel finally broke the silence. We should probably review everything together properly, he said. As a family. Vanessa nodded quickly in agreement. Yes, we should all be on the same page. I almost smiled at the timing. Only hours ago, they had already decided what my future should look like without consulting me. Now they wanted alignment. That will not be necessary immediately, I said calmly. There are legal and structural processes that must be followed first. Vanessa frowned slightly. Meaning, I answered, that decisions about assets of this scale are not made in living rooms or based on emotion. That sentence landed heavily in the kitchen. Daniel looked down at the table. Vanessa's hands tightened slightly in her lap. Neither of them spoke. I walked back to the table and picked up Harold's letter envelope that I had placed there earlier. Your father anticipated all of this, I said quietly. Every reaction, every assumption, every conversation we have had since the funeral. Daniel looked up sharply. He planned for this? He prepared for it. I corrected gently. There is a difference. The room grew quiet again. For a moment, I could almost feel Harold's presence in the way the conversation unfolded, as if he had already mapped every possible outcome and simply left me to watch it happen in real time. Vanessa stood slowly. We should give you some space, she said carefully. Daniel followed her lead immediately. We will come back tomorrow, he added. I nodded once. That is fine. They moved toward the hallway together, but before leaving, Vanessa paused. Evelyn, she said softly, we are not your enemies. I looked at her calmly. I am not treating you as enemies, I replied. I am simply observing what you choose to do when you believe there are no consequences. She did not respond. A moment later, the front door closed behind them, and the house returned to silence once again. But this time, the silence felt different. It no longer felt empty. It felt like space waiting to be filled. The house remained silent long after the front door closed behind Daniel and Vanessa. I stood in the hallway for a moment listening to the absence they left behind, as if even their uncertainty had weight that slowly dissolved into the air. Then I walked back into the kitchen and sat down at the same table where every conversation since the funeral had quietly reshaped my understanding of my own life. The late afternoon light had shifted again, stretching longer across the floorboards, softening the edges of the room. For a while, I did nothing. I simply sat with Harold's letter in front of me, my fingers resting lightly on the envelope as though it might still carry his voice through the paper. Eventually, I opened it again. I did not need to read every line anymore. I already understood the message. It was not about money. It was about timing. It was about watching people reveal themselves when restraint no longer benefited them. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the lockbox I had brought down from the study earlier. Then I stood and walked toward the home office at the far end of the hallway. Harold's office had always been a shared space, but over time it had become mine in practice, if not in name. I turned on the desk lamp and sat down, opening the laptop that still held access to several administrative accounts. For a moment, I hesitated, not because I doubted what needed to be done, but because I was aware of how easily life shifts once authority is no longer theoretical. I logged in. The screen illuminated quietly, revealing layers of financial structure most people in my family had never once bothered to understand. I navigated through the company dashboard slowly, reviewing holdings, subsidiaries, and active contracts. Everything was still exactly as Harold had left it. Stable, structured, controlled. A soft notification sound broke the silence. An incoming email from Richard Bennett. Subject line, post-meeting confirmations. And immediate authorization requirements. I opened it and read carefully. As expected, there were procedural steps that needed to be completed within the next 48 hours. Board notifications. Banking authority confirmations. Updated trustee filings. Nothing urgent in tone, but everything important in consequence. I replied briefly, confirming receipt and requesting full execution of Harold's final administrative instructions without delay. My tone was calm, precise, and without hesitation. When I closed the laptop, the room felt different again. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the office. For years I had worked behind Harold in silence, managing details that allowed him to appear effortless in public. Now there was no behind. There was only forward. A vibration from my phone pulled me out of my thoughts. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the call ring twice before it stopped. Almost immediately, a text followed. We should talk before anything moves further. Daniel is very concerned about misunderstandings. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down without responding. Misunderstandings. That was an interesting choice of word for people who had already begun reorganizing my life before the funeral flowers had even wilted. Another notification appeared minutes later. This time, an email forwarded from Daniel's account to Vanessa, copied unintentionally to me due to system permissions I had never removed. The subject line read, "Next steps for property liquidation strategy." I read the first paragraph without expression. There were references to valuation estimates, timing considerations, and potential buyer interest for residential assets. My home. The home Harold and I had built together over decades. I closed the email slowly and placed the phone face down on the desk. There was no surprise left in me, only confirmation. I stood and walked back into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. As I drank it slowly, I realized something simple but final. They had not been waiting for grief to pass. They had been waiting for silence they could use. And now that silence had ended, I moved through the house with steady steps, turning off unnecessary lights, checking doors, and adjusting small details that Harold had always insisted were part of maintaining order. At the entryway, I paused beside the front table where the envelope had first appeared. I placed my hand on the wood surface and allowed myself a brief moment of stillness. Not sadness, not anger, recognition. Then I picked up my phone and called Richard Bennett directly. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Harper," he said immediately. "I assume you have reviewed the preliminary documents." "Yes," I replied. My voice sounded steady even to myself. "Proceed with full enforcement of Harold's final directives." There was a short pause on the line. "Understood," Richard said. "I will initiate formal notification protocols tomorrow morning." I ended the call and set the phone down. Outside, evening had fully arrived. The house was now illuminated only by the soft glow of interior lights reflecting against the windows. For the first time since the funeral, I was no longer reacting to what others were doing. I was simply establishing what would happen next. And somewhere in that quiet realization, I understood exactly what Harold had meant when he said to wait until after the funeral. It was never about what they would take. It was about what they would reveal. The morning after I made the call to Richard Bennett arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself was holding its breath before the consequences began to unfold. I woke earlier than usual and sat at the edge of my bed for a long moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. There was no urgency in me anymore, only clarity. When I finally stood, I moved through my routine slowly, making coffee, opening the curtains, and letting the pale morning light fill the rooms Harold and I had once shared without thinking about ownership or control. Everything now felt different, not because the house had changed, but because I had. Around mid-morning, my phone began to light up repeatedly. First came a message from Daniel. "Mom, Richard called in. Emergency board notice. We need to understand what is happening." Then another from Vanessa. "Please call me immediately. This is going to create serious issues for the family." I read both messages without responding. There was nothing to clarify, nothing to negotiate, nothing to soften. The structure Harold had built and the authority he had transferred to me years earlier was now being activated exactly as he had instructed. By noon, the first official email from Richard arrived. It was brief and direct. Formal notifications have been issued to all board members and financial stakeholders of Harper Industrial Holdings. Full compliance procedures are now in effect under the controlling trustee authority of Evelyn Harper. I set the phone down and looked out the kitchen window. The garden was quiet, the same garden where Harold and I had once argued about expansion plans, landscaping costs, and long-term investment strategies that no one else in the family had ever bothered to learn. That memory no longer felt heavy. It felt complete. Later that afternoon, I heard the first car arrive. Then another. I did not need to look outside to know who it was. The pattern of urgency, the inconsistency in timing, the way people arrived only when consequences became real instead of theoretical, it all told me enough. I opened the front door calmly. Daniel stood at the base of the steps first, his expression tight with disbelief and concern. Vanessa stood beside him, her posture less confident than before, her usual composure replaced with visible tension. Margaret arrived last, holding a folder that looked hastily assembled. None of them spoke immediately. They simply looked at me as though trying to understand how the version of me they had constructed in their minds no longer matched the reality standing in front of them. Finally, Daniel stepped forward. "Mom, this is escalating faster than we expected," he said. I nodded once. "It is proceeding exactly as it should." Vanessa followed quickly. "Richard is restructuring communication access, freezing certain accounts, and requesting formal approvals for any financial movement. We were not prepared for this level of control." I looked at her steadily. "You were not supposed to be prepared," I replied. Margaret exhaled sharply. "Evelyn, surely you understand this affects all of us." I held her gaze for a moment. "What affects all of us," I said calmly, "is that assumptions were made before anyone asked a single question." Silence followed. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling to process the shift in authority. "We thought we were helping you manage things," he said more quietly. I stepped slightly to the side, allowing them all to see the house behind me. "This house," I said, "has been managed by me for over 2 decades. The company you are referring to has been structured and stabilized through decisions I was responsible for long before any of you were involved in its operations." Vanessa's voice softened, but only slightly. "Then why did you never tell us the extent of your role?" I considered the question for a moment. "Because it was never relevant until you decided it was." That answer seemed to land differently, not as rejection, but as finality. A few seconds passed before Daniel spoke again, this time with less certainty. "What happens now?" I looked at him directly. For the first time since the funeral, I saw not entitlement or assumption, but uncertainty without direction. "Now," I said, "everything continues according to the structure your father and I built together, not according to interpretation." Margaret tightened her grip on her folder. "And our role in that structure?" she asked carefully. I paused before answering. "That will depend entirely on how you choose to conduct yourselves moving forward." No one responded. The weight of that sentence settled into the space between us without needing further explanation. It was not a threat. It was an observation. A simple reflection of how systems respond when trust is no longer automatic. I stepped back toward the door. "Richard will continue communications through formal channels," I said. "If there are legitimate questions, they will be addressed appropriately." Daniel hesitated. "Mom," he said more quietly, "we did not mean for things to become like this." I looked at him one last time. "Intentions do not always determine outcomes," I replied. Then I closed the door gently, not to shut them out, but to close a chapter that had already finished writing itself long before any of them realized it. Inside the house, silence returned once again, but it was no longer empty. It was structured, defined, final. I walked back into the kitchen and placed a fresh cup of coffee on the table. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of a car engine starting again, then fading down the street. I did not move to watch it leave. Instead, I sat down slowly, opened Harold's letter once more, and read the final line I had almost memorized. "Let them see clearly who they are before you decide what they are to become in your life." I folded the letter and placed it beside me, then looked around the room with a quiet understanding that no longer carried confusion or doubt. For the first time since the funeral, I was not being defined by what I had lost or what others assumed I lacked. I was simply the one holding the truth that had been there all along.